Okay, I'm gonna make an attempt to um, give a make their the there being of Dasein, or to give a more um, satisfying account of Dasein. So I mean, the usual accounts of Dasein are horrible because all they say it. I mean, the smack of the bad circularity in the sense that I think all statements are circular, but all statements go from, you say something like, there's a tree, somebody asks you for clarification, you say a tree is that thing and you point to it, or you say a tree is a kind of plant. And then, oh, a tree is a kind of plant? Oh, that's just circular mumbo jumbo, you didn't tell me anything. Well, but actually, strictly speaking, you did tell them something, they just don't think it really adds anything. So I think that's the way I feel about what the professors say, how should I say that, what the conventional answer is to Dasein. It's like, oh, you just, it's like, it's a dilettante's answer. It's horrible. That's what makes it so sickening. It's like somebody's presenting themselves as a Heideggerian scholar, which they may be, and because they're doing all kinds of research which doesn't have anything to do with actually understanding his philosophy, which I don't want to diminish because within certain limits it's absolutely necessary. But I mean, looking at the history of looking at documents and looking at linguistic questions. But the actual question of what Dasein is, when it's simply given this textbook answer of, oh, Dasein is us. It's used. I mean, it's nothing. It tells you something if you didn't know anything, but it's not sufficient. So let me try to. So that's why. And then primitive attempts would be to say that Dasein is not the subject. That would be the first thing to say. Dasein is not a subject. It's just an opening. It's a Reigness. Whereas Deleuze is still doing a subject, as the Gambit says. It's not a Marxian. It's not in a Marxian constellation. So that gives it some definition in a negative sense. It's not a subject. It's not Cartesian, as Dreyfus would emphasize, or something like that. But still, it's almost nothing. And then you have all kinds. It doesn't really tell you anything about the phenomenon of Dasein, about what we're really getting to. So I want to try to thematize Dasein as an epigogic observation of the epigogic character of how of what being is. So let's start by saying, since it has some content, therefore it exists, and Dasein is basically identical to Yahweh or to Odin or to any of the creation gods, to Brahman, to the Neoplatonic demiurge, to anything that doesn't go. Maybe I would say the push, when you push Dasein further, you would get to the Ein Sof, or you'd get to something like, you would get to the full sense of the mystery of the Trinity, rather than all the things one can say about the Trinity in Catholic theology, but the full sense of the mystery. Maybe you'd get to the in the Eastern Church, to the stuff about what's his name, Gregory, I forget the name of the guy that argued for that thing about the quietness, about the standing in the sort of in the center of the tornado. Gregory Palamas, is that what it said? Or Palamas? Yeah, something like that. It seems to me goes beyond the philosophic sense of in the full sense that there's the philosophy of reflection. I think that's the philosophy. That's how Heidegger understands his initial critique of being, is that he finds himself in the philosophy of reflection, or the Athenian explication of being. Well, but it goes back to Parmenides, I suppose. But that which was developed by the Athenians as sort of epigons of Parmenides in a way. The philosophy of something of being available for reflection, rather than what he's calling existence, where one way into existence is the Jungian way. That I'd say that just because anybody that knows Jung makes a big fuss about what was topical in his day in philosophic on the theories of philosophical fundamental experiences, which was that there was this distinction to be made between the irrational types, the sensation type, and the intuition type, so-called, and the rational type, the feeling type, who says this is agreeable, this is disagreeable. That's a form of rationality. And the thinking type who says this is what, who asks, what is this? What is the T, or what is the that? That's in the reflection. So that in a way, in that light, philosophy then, the Athenian philosophy then looks to be simply like thinking that hasn't, in a way, presented itself as one way of existing alongside this other three, and hasn't really taken into account that. Then you get something like, so Heidegger's he's examining what are the theoretical presuppositions in his time. So he grew up and got a Jesuit training, and then he became aware of these philosophic questions of the historical consciousness. So, for instance, in Christianity, that there began to be taken a belief that there were certain situations obtained at certain moments, like Cardinal Newman's famous writing about does the doctrine develop or whatever. And then it becomes clear that there's sort of like, at certain moments in Christian history, certain ideas are demanded and come to power, and then you start to wonder when you can get to the absolute Christianity. And then Heidegger says that these problems are really too serious to be bound up by the Catholic oath, and I have to be able to think about this more freely, and not just to modify or attempt to perfect this already existing teaching, but look at the phenomenon. But let's try to get more positive content to Dasein. So Dasein is located in this moment of the throwing out of the philosophy of reflection taken naively, but in the mode where you're saying I can't let somebody else be the authority on these things because too many questions have been raised. It was said for 1,000 years or more. Aristotle, the master of those who know, and then it was considered he's very good authority, and even if we criticize him a little bit, we probably should be very, very modest about it. We don't want to be like Graham Harman, totally arrogant, just talking bullshit. But we want, or just doing something of very limited scope and importance, and basically juvenile, because it's so lacking in cogency. His version of Heidegger. But we want to be very modest because we think this is real authority, and then taken this way, so it's not that Galileo came in and said, which he did, and said, okay, Aristotle has made some mistakes in his physics, and we can go over to the inertial frame of reference presupposition, which makes science take over everything, so that it's no longer a question of reflection, but a question of cataloging according to a pre-existing epigogic, how does the Heidegger call it, the Entstellung. So the Entstellung acts as the epigogic filter, so that every experience is already presupposed to be of a nature of sort of that there's a space, and space is the literal outside thing, and that language has cropped up in order to correspond to space as the outside thing, where tests according to the ideal, to the Galilean ideal of the inertial frame of reference. Space is then modified by Minkowski and Einstein, but it's fundamentally the same idea is in place as the guide. Somehow the word epigogic contains the word to guide or to lead to or to bring to. I think pedagogic is the same thing with relation to people sitting at the feet at the ped, which means children in the earliest schooling. So that's one sense that Heidegger locates as the essence of the current Dasein. So that's the point of Dasein. Then, when he's talking about or that's a way into the Dasein that I think is more clear about what Dasein is. It's that experience is happening for Dasein always according to these filters, and then he analyzes that quite a bit more in detail in terms of the sense of throwing, a sense of questioning the Aristotle metaphysics, the problem groups around the Aristotle metaphysics data on the energia and dunamis, which, however, of course, he's trying to really see if it's right rather than just totally modestly take it on their word, but in a way that is he becomes docile before it to learn it, and then he does Auseinandersetzung and challenges it, and he doesn't want to just take it on that Aristotle said it, or that Vladimir said it, or somebody said it. In this way, he presents Dasein as something where everything that's said about it is not is to be checked, as it were. So there's already going something like, Sheehan calls it a priori a lot of times, which I think is a little bit, it's sort of like he doesn't, but then he doesn't specify, or is he talking just in the vernacular, because one says a priori outside of philosophic discussion also, because it's the problem with that is, of course, you don't know whether to take it in the Kantian sense, which is really the main sense it has in philosophy. In Kant, a priori is basically a priori of reason, and then it's the question of that's the other way to say epigogic, by the way, is inductive. But then inductive gets these different meanings. But then this a priori of reason in Kant, of the pure reason, reine Vernunft, it then shows this way of analyzing the way everything that we seek out of the sense, the blooming buzzing thing, to put it in the Henry James version of what he claims a child might see, or the Piaget version to make it more experimental and put it in a context which was then analyzed by Oppenheimer and others in Princeton in connection to the basic theory of the fact that you can't measure the position and the momentum, so you can't get I say so you can't really get a vector, but then the problem with that is that they use vector is a technical term, and then they transfer vector over to topology and other things so that it becomes confusing to speak that way. But I guess I should say you can't get a classical vector. But once you can't get a classical vector, then obviously you can't think in spatial terms in the way the Galilean physics did. You can't think in the way that what's the guy that Heidegger criticizes, the French guy Bergson, the way that Bergson basically theorizes, and then Spengler goes along with it too, is that basically language is about the spatial description of space. So all these kinds of sort of active Dasein factors into what we're born into, then Heidegger sees in the terms of something that he can kind of look at and then check to see if it's true. So in this sense, he's not a historicist. He's just saying, look, we have more preconceptions, congeries of them everywhere, fluttering around everywhere, coughing at everything. And it's harder to deal with that than it is maybe than it was for Plato and Aristotle. Or in another way, they didn't have the same type of noise bothering them that Plato and Aristotle had other difficulties probably. But it creates a situation where our task must be understood unless we're to deceive ourselves as very different from the task of Plato and Aristotle.